Thank you for coming this evening. Please turn to the book of Zechariah. As we continue, Zechariah chapter 8, we'll be beginning in verse 16 this evening. The book of Zechariah, as we have talked about, is one of the books in the period of the return from captivity. The people were in captivity in Babylon because of their sins. God had promised he would allow them to return, and they've returned. And now he's predicting some of the aspects of why they went into captivity in the first place, what they need to do to be faithful to him, and their future. So the first 6 chapters talked about various visions, emphasizing the fact that not only would God punish his enemies, but that there would come a future kingdom and a future king who would be both king and priest at the same time. And now in the last part of the book, chapters 7 through 14, just various prophecies about the people of Judah and their enemies, but also, obviously, many of them applying to the future kingdom. So in chapter 7 and 8, we had these questions about fasting. In chapter 8 in particular, the people asked whether or not they should continue fasting as they had done during the exile. They'd appointed various fasting days to show their grief and mourning for the fall of the temple, destruction of the temple, Nebuchadnezzar's invasions, and so forth. And so now that they've returned from captivity, they're asking whether or not they should continue those fasts. And God's answer basically is that they went into captivity because their ancestors, those alive at the time, would not obey God. They would not practice justice and treat others as they should. That's why they went into captivity in the first place. And so what he was more concerned about was their conduct, more so than whether they would fast for grieving for the problems that came as a result. So that's in chapter 8 then. He's continuing to discuss that. And he's shown that he's now going to return them to favor. And this has been emphasized throughout the book, various ways that the priests would once again serve as priests, and Zerubbabel, the governor, once again have authority, and they would lead them in rebuilding the temple and so on. So now he's discussing, in the middle of chapter 8, he's discussing their relationship to him now, in contrast to the problems that sent them into captivity. And what is he saying that they need to do in order to solve the problems of the past? What does he require of them now in his teaching? Sharon?
Instead of fasting and sorrowing over the particular dates of the punishment, they need to focus on doing what's right so that they don't have that punishment anymore.
Okay, so the problem was that they went into captivity because of sin. The lesson to learn is don't sin. Do what God says. That's the thing that's really important to him. He wasn't upset about their fasting, but what they're concerned about, whether they should continue it, what should really be concerned about is doing what's right, so that they don't have the problems that were caused by their sins in the first place. So that's pretty much what's being discussed in chapter 8. As we get down to, and we covered last time, as I recall, through verse 15. We started with verse 16, but I want to go back over verse 14 and 15 just briefly to get the context. Questions or comments before we start with verse 16 this evening? All right, let's go ahead and read then. Let's read 14 through, let's go through the end of the chapter. Who'd like to read chapter 8, verse 14 through the end of the chapter, please? Chapter 8, verse 14 through the end of the chapter, please. Bill, please.
For thus says the Lord of hosts, just as I determined to punish you when your fathers provoked me to wrath, says the Lord of hosts, and I would not relent. So again in these days I'm determined to do good to Jerusalem and to the house of Judah. Do not fear, these are the things you shall do. Speak each man the truth to his neighbor. Give judgment in your gates for truth, justice, and peace. Let none of you think evil in your heart against your neighbor, and do not love a false oath. For all these things that I hate, says the Lord. Then the word of the Lord of hosts came to me, saying, Thus says the Lord of hosts, the fast of the 4th month, the fast of the 5th, the fast of the 7th, the fast of the 8th, shall be joy and gladness and cheerful feasts for the house of Judah. Therefore love truth and peace. This said the Lord of hosts. Peoples shall yet come, inhabitants of many cities. The inhabitants of one city shall go to another, saying, let us continue to go and pray before the Lord, and seek the Lord of hosts. You myself will go also. Yes, many peoples and strong nations shall come to seek the Lord of hosts in Jerusalem, and to pray for the Lord. This said the Lord of hosts. In those days 10 men from every language of the nation shall yes the seed of the Jewish man, saying, let us go with you, for you have heard that God is with you.
Okay. So in verses 14 and 15, as we talked about last time, he's saying he's going to keep his promises. He said that he would send their fathers into captivity for their sins if they didn't repent. And that's what he did. They wouldn't correct their lives, so he sent them into captivity. Now he's saying he also told them that they would return from captivity and he would do them good. And he's going to keep that promise too. A promise for good, promise for evil. He's kept them both. So now they've returned, and now he's going to tell them again what he expects of them and some about their future. Okay? So question 16, or verse 16 rather, and question number 18. What does he say he expects of them now? What does he require of them now, verse 16? Susie.
To speak truth, to execute judgment with truth, justice and peace, not to think evil against their neighbors, and not to love a false oath.
Okay. So question number 19. How does that compare to what he had taught them before they went into captivity? Right.
They had been unjust and without mercy, doing and thinking evil against their neighbor and their brothers, and oppressing the widows, fatherless, the aliens, and the poor.
Okay. So the point is, it's the same thing, basically. He's saying your fathers went into captivity because they wouldn't obey these instructions. Now I'm giving you the same instructions. Are you going to obey them? So that's the lesson that he wants them to learn, which we've been showing throughout the 2 chapters, that the fasting, he hasn't mentioned that specifically here, but the fasting is not the main thing. Being sorry for the consequences of what was done in the past, far better to do what's right than you don't suffer the consequences. Okay? So he's saying that he will do them good, but they've got to do what he says. It's conditional on their continuing to serve him faithfully. Verse 16. Questions, comments, verse 16? It continues into verse 17. What else does he say in verse 17 that they need to do? Still actually question number 18. What else does he say they need to do in verse 17? Bill.
Not to think evil in your heart against your neighbor, and do not love a false oath.
Okay. And again, God says he hates all these things. All right, so verse 16 and 17 summarize the same things that he expects of them now were to correct the things that they went into captivity for in the first place. Okay, other comments on verse 17 through 17?
David?
Yes, Rick.
Back in verse 16, where
Yes.
it says, should give judgment in your gates, does that mean your household?
Okay. Comments on judgment in the gates. What is the significance of judgment in the gates? Karen.
Well, it seems like there's quite a few references to the elders throughout the Old Testament meeting at the gates, and questions of the law and judgments about people would come to them there.
Okay. I think that's the answer, Rick. A number of passages, or you can go, for example, the book of Esther, and lots of passages to talk about the gates of the city were the places where judges would judge various cases and so on. A lot of business was done there. It's like our town squares. And so what he's saying is that they should do justice, truth, righteousness, peace, and so on in the places of their judgments, whether they make these decisions. rather than, as they had in the past, where the rulers would make unfair and unjust decisions. Okay? Other comments on the justice in the gate aspect of it. Okay? Anything else to verse 17? All right? So now more information comes to Zechariah, verse 18, from the Lord. And now he talks about the fast. So up to this point, he's just discussing what he expects of them. Now he's going to talk about the fast again in verse 19. And what does he say that they should do rather than the fasting? Notice that he mentions 4 different fasts this time. So far we talked about 2 of them, but here there's 4 of them apparently that they missed. And it doesn't tell why they were fasting at these particular times. So we can maybe make some assumptions about them. The 7th month was when Gedaliah was slain. The 10th month was when Nebuchadnezzar began to siege the city. The 4th month, then of the following year, of course, was when the wall of Jerusalem was breached. In the 5th month, then when the temple was destroyed. So presumably those were the kinds of things that they were fasting about. But that's not what they were, isn't the important point. What is important? What does God want them to do now? Rather, they've asked the question, should we continue to fast? What does God say he wants them to do in the last part of verse 19? And we're on question number 21 now. What does he want them to do? Rick?
Well, I don't know if this is right or not, but I've always thought of fasting as a sober, solemn occasion. And now he's telling them to have joy and gladness and cheerful feasts.
Okay. So instead of grieving like they had because of going into captivity, now he's saying, okay, I'm with you now. I'm dwelling in the temple. I'm back in fellowship with you. And I'm receiving you back. Whereas before, as in the book of Hosea, you were not my people, now you are my people again. So now there should be joy and gladness. Rather than the sorrow of the fast, there should be joy and gladness. So love, truth, and peace, live the kind of life that I want, and we'll have a good relationship. Okay? Other comments through verse 19 then. Sure.
These 2 chapters, excuse me, kind of remind me of answering our children's questions. Sometimes they ask us a complicated question, and we say, well, yes, but, and we launch into this long explanation why that's not really the main point, or there's something else they need to focus on, or whatever. He's just now getting around to actually directly answering their question, but it took 2 chapters to remind them that that's not even the point anymore.
Right. And sometimes, well, preachers can get long-winded, can't they? And sometimes, if we're not careful, we lose the train of thought. But Zechariah, God has important things for him to say. He's emphasizing, this is what's important. Now, okay, what you've done is not wrong, but that's not the emphasis now. Look now at what the blessings you have and express your appreciation for the renewed relationship that you have with God. Other questions, comments through verse 19? Any thoughts anybody has and applications for us from that? Frank?
We also should love truth and peace.
Okay, so first of all the things he expected of them, he still expects of us, doesn't he? Treating other people right, don't plot evil against your neighbor, love justice, and treat other people right, and so on. God still hates those things today. So first of all, the lesson for us is, if we want God's fellowship, we must live that kind of life. Don't expect to be able to live in sin and God have a fellowship with you. It won't work that way. So that's the most important lesson. That was the lesson for them, and that's the most important lesson for us too. Okay? Other comments on lessons for us here? Okay, well, this emphasis on then now that your relationship is restored, you're emphasizing joy and gladness in verse 19 seems to me to also teach us then that we should appreciate the blessings we have as children of God. That whereas we were lost in sin and out of God's fellowship, that should have caused us sorrow. We should be sorry for the wrongs we did, but we should also remember, okay, now we've been forgiven, now we're his children, and we should rejoice in that. And this should give us a sense of peace and joy for our relationship that we have with God now. Other comments or discussion through verse 19. Well, we finish up the chapter then, Susie.
Well, I was just thinking of a passage in Psalms, it's chapter 30, verses 4 and 5, sings, "Praise to the Lord, you saints of his, and give thanks at the remembrance of his holy name, for his anger is but for a moment, his favor is for life. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning."
Okay. And sometimes we tend to dwell on, I know I do, the crazy, wrong things I've done in the past, and how irritating that is to me that I did those things. But also, we need to appreciate the fact that God has forgiven us. If we serve him as we should, and we repent of those sins, and we ask his, he forgives us. And we should remember that. Like Paul said in Philippians chapter 3, forgetting the things that are in the past. He had some terrible crimes in his past. You have to get beyond that and appreciate what God has done for us to make us his children. Okay? All right, now verse 20 through 23. The Lord has something else to say, and, well, let's just discuss it and then we'll make some application. What does he say? Question 23. Oh, got that. 24. What does he predict for the future? Question 24. What is he predicting for the future? In verse 20, goes down really through verse 23, actually. But what do you see as predicting in the future, beginning of verse 20? Rick.
Well, people from other nations will be coming to Jerusalem because they've heard of God and they've heard of his power and they want to be in touch with God.
Okay. So there's going to be people coming, as Rick said, inhabitants of various cities, coming to Jerusalem, he says, to pray before the Lord and seek the Lord. And how does he describe the numbers who will come? Verse 22. 22. How many people are going to be coming? Terry.
It describes them as many people and strong nations.
Many people and strong nations will come to seek the Lord of hosts in Jerusalem and to pray before the Lord. Now, think of our terminology, especially in the prophecy. Peoples, nations. Who's talking about? When he talks about peoples and nations, that's who? Gentiles. Okay? Israel is the nation, the people. Like Trevor's been talking about in our Sunday morning class, the people of God, the people. Peoples, nations, that's Gentiles, that's other nations, okay? So here is a prediction that Gentiles from many cities will come, and they'll go to worship the Lord and seek the Lord of hosts. Many nations, many people, strong nations will come to the Lord. So, question then, what does this mean? Question number 25 and 26 especially. What's the fulfillment of the prediction? Terry.
This seems to be a messianic prophecy that's fulfilled in Acts 2 and Acts 10 and 8, and then on through the book of Acts when Paul preaches to the Gentiles.
Okay.
Cornelius and the Ethiopian eunuch are involved in coming from other nations, the Gentiles, and they come to Jerusalem. The Ethiopian came to Jerusalem to worship, and here's the gospel.
Okay. Now, I know that there were some proselytes under the Old Testament who became Jews, followed the Old Testament law, but certainly it wouldn't fit the description here of many peoples from many strong nations and so on coming to seek the Lord. So there may have been some application to the proselytes under the Old Testament, but the way it's described, this is exactly what it seems to me like Terry is talking about under the New Testament, the new covenant, the message is for go into all the world and preach the gospel to creatures of every nation. Matthew 28 and Mark 16. Everybody, including Gentiles. And that emphasized over and over again in the New Testament. God has no special physical nation now. He has a spiritual nation, which ties then back into the visions that we studied in Zechariah, this coming king who would rule as king and priest. But it's not just the nation of Israel and Judah. Many nations, Gentiles, are going to come and become part of it. Okay? Other comments on the significance of verses 20 through, 22. We haven't talked about 23 yet, but any other comments on the significance of this prophecy? All right, so you can add this to the list of many, many other prophecies, many that we studied even here in the book of Zechariah. Remember, chapter 2 talked about people from other nations coming. Isaiah talks about this frequently, about the Gentiles becoming, and Paul, Romans chapter 15, applies it because he was especially a apostle to the Gentiles. Again and again, he makes the point. It's not just Jews, it's not just Israelites, it's Gentiles. Everybody. Here the prophecy is predicting many people. And so the Jerusalem then, of course, is spiritual Jerusalem. It's the church. It's not physical Jerusalem anymore. That's why we've seen again and again this temple being rebuilt and the restoration of the priests and the governor and so on is symbolic. It's not just about those people at that time. Symbolic of the gospel and the Christ and the church. You and me today. Okay? Other comments through 22. How does he describe it in verse 20? Oh, Rick, sure, go ahead.
I tied that in with 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 4, where God desires all men to be saved and to come to the knowledge of Him.
And read verse 6 while you're there too, Rick.
I'm not there. I just had it wrote down.
Okay. He was quoting it from his notes. Okay, but verse 6 says a similar thing, that God wants all to know the truth and be saved. And lots of other passages that say the same thing. Okay, other comments? Okay, now about verse 23. It's a similar thing. What are people going to say in verse 23? Similar to what we were talking about. Frank.
Well, it reads that that many people will take the sleeve of a Jewish man, saying, "Let us go with you, for we have heard that God is with you."
Okay. But again, then the Jewish man is not physical Jew, but like Romans chapter 2, verse 28 and 29, one who is a Jew under the New Testament is not a physical Jew, but it's one who obeys God. You and I are Jews, spiritually. God's people under the New Testament, part of His kingdom, the church. And so, other people, we can bring other people to become part of, and then take part in this blessings of the gospel that he's talking about. Okay? And how about the 10 men? Comments on the 10 men. You can count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What's the 10 men mean? Susie?
Just a large number.
Just a large number, especially in prophecy. And there have been times when I've read in passages about, well, for example, when God said the people of Israel had complained against Him 10 times. And I go back, all right, 1, 2, 3. That's not the point. The point is it's a large, it's happened a lot of times. So there's going to be a lot of people who have will come, and those who are serving God faithfully, they want to be part of the people too. And so we need to seek those folks and give them that opportunity. Okay, anything else on chapter 8? With regard to the question about the fasting and the answer that God gave, and the lessons for us. Anything else? Okay, takes us into chapter 9 now. And a change in subject. So sometimes we have a couple of chapters that go together, then we have this kind of significant change in direction, which we have between chapter 8 and chapter 9. We would discuss now different as a subject. Let's go ahead and read some of it, and then we'll make some applications. All right, let's go ahead to, we can go at least 5 verses. Let's go with the first 5 verses, and we'll go from there then. We'd like to read verses 1 through 5 for us, please. Chapter 9, verse 1 through 5. Rick, 10, please.
The burden of the word of the Lord against the land of Hadrach and Damascus, its resting place, for the eyes of men and all the tribes of Israel are on the Lord. Also against Hamath, which borders on it, and against Tyre and Sidon, though they are very wise. For Tyre built herself a tower, heaped up silver like the dust, and gold like the mire of the streets. Behold, the Lord will cast her out, he will destroy her power in the sea, and she will be devoured by fire. Ashkelon will see it and fear. Gaza also will be very sorrowful. In Ekron, for he dried up her expectation. The king shall perish from Gaza, and Ashkelon shall not be inhabited.
All right, so you see we've reached a significantly different topic. What's he discussing in these verses beginning in chapter 9? What's he talking about? What's I'd say the theme of what we've been reading about here? Question number 1, chapter 9. What's he talking about? Terry.
This is like in many prophets, this is the nations section of his prophecy where he discusses that God is the God of all nations and he's going to bring judgment against all nations.
Okay. And so we've begun a section in which he's discussing judgment on the enemies. But it's going to contrast as we go through it to his blessings on the people of Judah. That's what the book's been about so far, right? He's talked repeatedly about how he's going to punish the enemies, the nations around that are in sin, but he's going to bless the people of Judah. And in particular, people from some of these nations are going to come to the Lord. But a lot of them are going to be punished because of their sins, because they won't serve the Lord. So he starts with Hadrach, Damascus, and Hamath. All right, so I ask you question number 2. What do you know about these places? Tell me what you know about Hamath and Hadrach and Damascus. Frank.
Well, they were all cities of Syria, and they were rich and prosperous in trade. And Hamath was a royal city.
Okay. All right, so just to help us out a little bit, get a bit of maps here, and you can see then here is, if I can get this to work. All right, here's Jerusalem down here. Syria is this area north of Israel, and Damascus was the capital city, and Hamath is clear up here, and Hadrach, I have no idea where that is. In fact, I don't know, none of the sources that I read knew where it was. But apparently it was one of the cities of Syria. So he starts out talking about these cities, and then he'll go to Tyre and Sidon, which are on the seacoast. Okay? So anything else you know about Hamath and Damascus and Hadrach? Anybody anything else on that? Okay? So he's going to, what does he say about it now? So these, he names these cities, and they're often in the Old Testament, these were enemies of the people of Israel and enemies of Judah. Okay, so what does the Lord say about them? And then when it gets more specifically about Tyre and Sidon, well, let's talk about Tyre and Sidon. We didn't mention it. What do you know about Tyre and Sidon? Verse 2. Information about Tyre and Sidon? Yes, Karen.
They're wealthy seaport cities.
Wealthy seaport cities? Where'd they get their wealth? Well,
Well, Hiram, the king of Tyre, helped in the materials for the building of the temple.
okay, so at one point, Tyre was helpers, and they were in league with the people of Israel, especially in the times of David and Solomon, helped provide what they needed to build the temple, but they were By this point, of course, had become quite enemies. Okay, what else do you know about them? Okay, they got their riches from sea trade. They were merchants on the Mediterranean Sea. And they sent ships all over the place, and some of them also were ships with Solomon in the stories of Solomon. So they're very rich. Not because they raised crops themselves or it was flocks and herds, so they just cities on the sea. They got their wealth by trading with other people, with other nations. Okay? Anything else about Tyre and Sidon you want to bring up? Velma?
Also in Damascus, it's well known even yet today, we use fabrics called the fabrics of silk, come from Damascus, and they made swords. So they were well known for a lot of industry.
Okay, that's Damascus you were talking about. Yes, okay. Anything else? All right, so Tyre and Sidon then, the seacoast cities, he talks more specifically about them in verse 3. How does he describe their wealth in verse 3? How does he describe the wealth of Tyre in verse 3? Terry?
Silver like dust and gold like the mire in the streets.
Just like you and me, right? So much silver and gold, it's just like dirt you walk on. You know, just so much of it. Okay, well, that's rich. Very well. Of course, it's an exaggeration, of course. I'm sure they didn't just walk on it, but it shows how rich they were with silver and gold. Okay? How about other comments on verse 3? Susie?
Well, verse 2 says that they thought they were very wise and powerful because they built a tower. Makes you think of Babel.
Okay. All right. They're very wise, thought they were wise, and thought that they were invincible. Anybody know the history of the city of Tyre and why they thought nobody could conquer them? They thought that nobody was going to be able to defeat them. Do you know why? Did you find any reading on that? Carrie?
I believe there was an island right off the coast that if an enemy came, they would flee to that island, and then they felt like they couldn't get to them.
Okay, excellent. And they built up that island. They didn't just have an island out there. They had huge walls and towers to protect it and so on. And so when enemies would come, they'd go to that island, and they'd be a fortress, and they thought nobody could get to them because any army on the land wouldn't be able to get to them to capture them. Okay? But God says it's going to happen anyway. It's not. It seems wise, seems like you're powerful, but He's going to take care of it anyway. Okay? Other comments through verse 3. All right, so verse 4 now. What's God going to do? Let's see, where are we? Question 5. What's God going to do to her? Bill.
The Lord's going to cast her out and destroy her power in the sea, and she's going to be devoured by fire.
All right. Think you're strong. Got all this wealth, all this defenses and wisdom, and you think that nothing is going to be able to defeat you but the Lord. The Lord can cast you down. And of course, He's going to use enemies. But don't think your human ability can protect you. If God determines that you're going to fall, you're going to fall. Okay? And she'll be devoured by fire, it says. Comments to verse 4? Anybody know how it happened? The passage doesn't describe how the city fell, but anybody know how it fell? What brought about it? Susie?
I'm trying. Is this the one where? I'm not positive. Is this the one where Alexander the Great built the?
Causeway.
Yes, the causeway over there.
Yes. Yes. So they were attacked by a number of different nations, including powerful nations like Nebuchadnezzar. But they were not able to, none of the other enemies were able to completely overthrow the city because it was so powerful on this island. When Alexander the Great came, of course, he was conquering everybody. He just took the stones and dust and dirt from the land, threw it in the sea, and built a causeway for his men and their siege towers and so on to go right out to the island and attack it. And he defeated the city, and it was burned, but it didn't cease to exist yet. But as time went by, it completely fell. And God is saying that's what's going to happen. You think you're wise, you think you're strong, you're rich, but God can take care of that. And he did, using someone even more powerful than what they expected. Other comments to verse 4. Then in the prophecies of Syria and Tyre and Sidon. Anything else? Frank.
You see that God is in control over these nations, and he's still in control over the nations of the world today.
Yes. And Terry's point is he doesn't just pay attention to one nation, or even just a few people. And today, it's not just the United States that he's watching out for. All the other nations, they're all under his control. That doesn't mean he's going to punish them for every little wrong thing they do, or even some big wrong things. Eventually, the nations fall because they don't do the will of God, including this nation. If we don't, and we've made that point again and again, haven't we? Okay? Other comments through verse 4 and Syria and Tyre and Sidon. At verse 5, we begin a discussion of a new nation. And question number 6, it really takes into the next few verses, but let's go with just verse 5 at this point. What nations is he talking about in verse 5 then? Rick.
Ashkelon and Gaza.
Okay. And these are cities, actually. Gaza, Ekron, Ashkelon. Okay. And so we're going to talk some more about these, the part we haven't read yet. But what does he say about them in verse 5? Well, first of all, let's talk about the question number 7. What do you know about, what are these cities? What nation are we talking about here, and what do you know about these cities? Sharon.
3 of the 5 major cities of the Philistines along the coast further south.
All right, so these are the Philistines, and they're on the coast, just pretty much west of Jerusalem, whereas Tyre and Sidon were a good bit north along the seacoast. These cities are to the west along the coast, and these are Philistine cities. And once again, we've seen there's been lots of prophecies about the Philistines, as well as there were about Tyre and Sidon and Damascus and so on. These are pretty much common themes. They were enemies of God's people repeatedly, and God's saying it. He's going to take care of it. All right, what else do you know about these cities? Anything else you know about these Philistine cities? Any other comments on that? Question number 7. Other passages, question number 8. Other passages about the Philistines. Susie.
You want number 8?
Yeah.
With the prophecies against the Philistines?
Yes.
Okay, Zechariah 2 verses 4 through 7 talks about the destruction of Gaza, Ashkelon, Ekron, and Ashdod.
Okay, and we're going to talk about Ashdod before we're done here, and we talked about that, we said in Zephaniah. Remember the prophecies that we discussed then about the fall of the Philistines. So we've talked about these before. Amos also talks about it, Amos chapter 1. Okay, others? Rick.
In Jeremiah, chapter 47, verses 5 through 7, said, boldness has come upon Gaza. Ashkelon is cut off at the remnant of their valley. How long will you cut yourself? O you sword of the Lord, how long until you are quiet? Put yourself up into your scabbard, rest and be still. How can it be quiet, seeing the Lord has given it a charge against Ashkelon and against the seashore? There he has appointed it.
Okay, and so Jeremiah predicted their downfall. Isaiah predicted it as well. Ezekiel did. So once again, frequently, God warns about these nations because they were not doing his will and they had been enemies of his people. All right, so all of these nations, Philistine cities, these are all cities that we're talking about now, but they're Philistine cities. Okay? And God is predicting what will happen. So, right, so verse 5, then what's going to happen to it? Verse 5. And question number 9 now. What's going to happen to it? Terry.
Well, different things for each city was listed, but the races would be mixed in Ashdod and Ekron. There would be a drought. Ashkelon would be deserted, and sorrow for Gaza.
Okay. All right, so first of all, it starts out in verse 5. Ashkelon's going to see and hear and fear, I say, apparently about the fall of Tyre and Sidon. Why would they fear when they hear about what happened to Tyre in the previous verses? Why would they fear? Come on.
They would think they're right down the way and they'll
All
be
right,
next.
we're next.
Powerful nation under God.
Yeah, we're right down the seacoast. We're next. Any nation that could come and overthrow Tyre, what are we going to be able to do? And so they're going to be afraid and be sorrowful. Gaza would be sorrowful. Their expectations would be dried up. That is that they don't expect to be able to defeat whoever was able to defeat Tyre, and the king, the ruler, is going to perish. And the end result, Ashkelon will not be inhabited. Okay, so they expect they're going to be defeated just as surely as Tyre was, and suffer as a result. Okay, questions, comments through verse 5. Okay, we'll take up in verse 6. We continue with the Philistines next time. Take up verse 6 and talk about other nations, but watch for the prophecies mixed in with this about the future of God's people, in contrast to the punishments that come upon the enemies. Thank you very much.